Okay. The handouts for a couple more minutes. So I think what I'd like to do is just get started. The handouts will come up and we're not going to need the sources for a few minutes anyway. Okay. It's pouring outside. I'm not sure what all of you are doing here. So I hope this is good, because if it's not, then it will be a really bad day for all of you. So, all right. Okay, so this is the third in my series on Josephus. And just to recap what we've seen in the last two, because this third one I think we'll see is just a natural progression of what we've already discussed the last 2 weeks. What I discussed in my first talk was the way in which we shouldn't imagine Josephus as a traitor to his people. Rather, we should imagine Josephus as a great defender of the Jews at a pivotal turning point in Jewish history. So that is, the Jews are in a very precarious state in the aftermath of the destruction of the Second Temple. Josephus is part of the Roman party that makes its way to Rome in the aftermath of the destruction in the year 70 CE. And we talked about the anti-Jewish sentiment that is swirling around the capital in Rome after 70 CE for various reasons, most prominently the fact that the Flavian dynasty, the dynasty that was responsible for destroying the Beit HaMikdash, needed to capitalize on the propaganda value of that destruction. And as a result, Josephus was not betraying his people when he wrote his seminal work called The Jewish War. Rather, what Josephus was trying to do was to defend his people against some of the rumors, some of the propaganda that was circulating about the negative character of the Jews. We looked at a passage from Tacitus in which Tacitus basically says, look, the reason that the Jews rebelled is because they have a misanthropic character. They're fundamentally hateful of humanity, of all of our values. So, of course, it was inevitable that events were going to lead to this point. Josephus is responding to that claim, and the argument that he makes initially in his work, The Jewish War, which is the earliest of his works, which he writes in the year 79, what Josephus argues in Jewish War is that, in fact, we should not blame the Jews or Judaism as a whole for the rebellion, for the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. Rather, we should blame a very small subsection of Jews who whipped the rest of the Jews into a rebellious frenzy that resulted in the revolt against the Romans in the year 66, culminating in the destruction of Baiceni. But if, in fact, you care about Roman values, this is Josephus's argument, if you care about Roman values, you should admire the Jews, because after all, Judaism as a whole and Jews in general subscribe to the very same values as Romans in general. And we talked about one particular case study where Josephus talks repeatedly about the importance of manly courage. He talked about the fact that there are a number of cardinal virtues within the hierarchy of virtues in the Greco-Roman world, most prominent among which is the idea of manly bravery. I said in Greek, that's andreia. It's literally manliness. The word aner in Greek means man. So courage, bravery literally meant manliness. And Josephus's point was, if we look at various areas of halacha, we look at the way in which even the rebels behaved throughout the course of the rebellion, we can see that, in fact, the Jews are a brave people, and as such, you should admire them. You should embrace them as good, upstanding citizens of the Roman Empire. Okay, that's what we saw in the first talk. The result of that, and this is what we saw in the second talk, the result of that is that when we're reading Josephus, the right question to ask is not only, is Josephus a reliable historian? Did events actually transpire in the way that Josephus describes? That's not the right question, or that's not at least the only question. We need to ask an additional question, which is, why does Josephus tell the story in the way that he does? How did he shape the history in the service of his agenda? Where, as I said, his particular agenda was arguing that the Jews are upstanding citizens who should not be the object of, all of the anti-Jewish sentiment that was present in Rome. I tried to illustrate that point by looking side by side at two different narratives about King Herod in the context of Josephus. Josephus describes Herod in Jewish War, which is the work that I was just describing. Josephus also describes the reign of Herod in his later work called Antiquities of the Jews, which he writes in the year 93 or 94 CE, right? So again, 70 CE, destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, 79, the composition of Jewish war. About 15 years later, he writes what is really his magnum opus, namely Antiquities of the Jews. The description of Herod in each of these works is vastly different. What we said is that the characterization of Herod that we find in his first work, in Jewish War, is of a king who represents the best of the Jewish people. So that if what Josephus is trying to argue in Jewish War is that the Jews are law-abiding, upstanding Roman citizens who stand for all of the good Greco-Roman virtues like bravery, like temperance, then we should admire the most famous of the Jewish kings, King Herod, because after all, Herod, he tries to show, stands for all of those values. And so in Jewish War, he portrays Herod in a very positive way. We contrasted side by side passages in which Josephus tells the very same story in that earliest work, and then in his later work, Antiquities of the Jews. And what you see is that the portrait of Herod has been completely transformed. And that whereas Herod was described in positive, even glowing terms in his earliest work in Jewish War, when it comes to Antiquities of the Jews, Herod has now become a dark villain. We talked about a little bit what the differences are and why those would be. My suggestion was that we need to look not so much at Herod and his career. What we need to do is look at Josephus's evolving interests. And that whereas in his earliest work, what Josephus is trying to argue is that the Jews are, again, law-abiding, upstanding Roman citizens who stand for all of the good Greco-Roman values, Herod being the embodiment of that. What Josephus is trying to do in his latest work, in Antiquities of the Jews, is something very different, which is he's trying to illustrate that the Jews subscribe to the very same values as Romans, but not so much in terms of virtue, but specifically in terms of their form of government, their form of political ordering. In the same way that at that time, in the 90s CE, there was a lot of discussion in Rome about democracy as the ideal form of political ordering in place of monarchy. Monarchy under the Emperor Domitian, who was the king at that point, was in general reviled, precisely because Domitian himself was regarded as a kind of a very wicked king. And so what Josephus is doing in this latest of his works, in Antiquities of the Jews, is basically saying, look, the Jews also prefer other forms of political ordering to monarchy. What Josephus talks about there is that they prefer priestly aristocracy to monarchy, but basically he portrays Herod in a way that makes Herod consistent with Greco-Roman views on monarchy at precisely that time. And so that if the Romans are saying all kinds of nasty things about kings, about monarchs, Josephus has the same things to say about Herod, in which case, even though Josephus's focus on Herod is different, his overall objective is the same, which is to say that what Josephus is trying to argue is that Jews and Romans are very much aligned, right? Aligned in different ways, but what you see by comparing these two portraits of Herod side by side is that Josephus is a very heavy-handed author. He is very involved in shaping his history. He's not simply just cutting and pasting from sources that he's received. And it's important just to appreciate the chronology here. So Herod, we said, Herod's reign lasts from 37 BCE until 4 BCE. Josephus is writing sometime between 79 CE and 94 CE, which means that Josephus is writing 80 to 100 years after the death of Herod. So he's clearly relying on source material. But what's important to appreciate is the role that Josephus played in shaping that material, rather than simply asking who was Herod. The question instead is, who was Josephus's Herod? Okay, that's by way of recap. What I want to do today in talking about Masada is basically continue to pursue the same line of analysis. The question is not going to be what happened at Masada. That's going to be part of the question. But really, the focus is going to be not what happened at Masada, but what happened at Josephus's Masada? Namely, how did Josephus tell the story about Masada and for what purpose? Okay, so before we get to the sources themselves, let me try to outline a little bit what we know about Masada. So Masada was one of Herod's palaces, one of his winter palaces. He actually built a number of palaces in the Judean desert as his winter palaces. Another one of his very important palaces is known as Herodium. It's actually an amazing archaeological site. They've discovered Herod's tomb at Herodium. Josephus actually says he was buried at Herodium, and you can go visit his tomb. It's really a very worthwhile visit in Israel. Masada is the most famous of his palaces. And what happens after the rebellion breaks out in the year 66 CE, so again, 70 years after Herod's death, a number of the rebels raid the palace of Masada, and they confiscate a lot of the arms that had been stored there. What we're going to see in a couple of minutes is that there were a lot of supplies that had been left by Herod in the aftermath of his death, including decades worth of food, right? It happens to be that there were 1,000 rebels that congregated at Masada, so it wasn't practical for the food supply there to last for decades. But in fact, there was decades worth of food, and there were a lot of artillery, a lot of heavy arms there. And the rebels in the year 66 made their way to Masada precisely to confiscate these arms. The rebels who are involved in that raid then go back to Jerusalem, led by a rebel leader named Menachem. The story that Josephus tells about Menachem is that he presented himself almost as this who was going to lead the Jews in rebellion, and that offended many of the other leaders of the rebellion. I talked about in my first lecture was the fact that the rebellion wasn't led by one individual. There was a war council that was convened, and the war council basically parceled out different areas of Israel under the command of specific leaders. And so the notion that you would have this one person named Menachem who would somehow reserve for himself the role as leader of the rebellion, and not just leader of the rebellion, but sort of a messianic leader of the rebellion, offended the sensibilities of many of the Jews at that time. And so what ends up happening is this Menachem is forced to flee. He and his party flee back to Masada. Now, it's important to note, and this is something we're going to see when we begin the sources, this Menachem, according to Josephus, is descended from the very first of the rebellious Jews. The story that Josephus tells about this rebellion actually predates the year 66 by about 60 years. So just to go back to Herod's dates for a moment, Herod dies, I said, in the year 4 BCE. For another 10 years, the Jews continue to be ruled by Herod's family. His son Archelaus rules as leader in Judea until the year 6 CE. And in the year 6 CE, Herod and his family, Herod and Archelaus, had been such cruel despots that the Jews go to the Romans and they say, we would rather be ruled directly by you Romans than to continue to be ruled by Herod's family. So the Romans comply, and that's when we begin to see the system of what are called first prefects and what are later called procurators, basically these low-level administrators, Romans who are ruling from Caesarea, who now shoulder the responsibility of ruling Israel directly. Basically, until the year 6 CE, even though the Romans had ruled over Israel going back to the 1st century BCE, the Jews continued to be ruled by themselves. They continued to enjoy political sovereignty until this moment when the Jews said, we would rather be ruled directly by you. But according to Josephus, that was not a unanimous sentiment. Josephus talks about somebody named Judas the Galilean. And Judas the Galilean, when the Romans come to take a census of the people, they're taking a census of the people because now they're ruling over them directly. What Judas the Galilean says is, we are not willing to be ruled by any human being. We're only willing to be ruled by God. Basically echoing the sentiment that Gideon himself says in Sefer Shoftim. Gideon is approached by the people in his time and who offer him the position of king. And Gideon says, Lo emshol ani bachem, I'm not going to rule over you. V'lo yimshol b'ni bachem, my son will not rule over you. Hashem yimshol bachem, and that basically is the very same message that Judas the Galilean delivers in the year 6 CE. Hashem yimshol bachem. And that is, according to Josephus, the moment at which rebellion kind of begins to spread under Judas the Galilean. what Josephus tells us about this Menachem, this leader of the rebellion who fled from Masada to Jerusalem and represents himself as this sort of messianic leader, Josephus says he was the son of Judas the Galilean. So what Josephus is doing is he's drawing a direct line between the beginning of the rebellion in the year 6 CE to the real flourishing of the rebellion in the year 66 CE. After Menachem is forced to flee, so he and his group go back to Masada. And at this point, he is replaced as leader by somebody named Elazar ben Yair. We're going to see as sort of the hero of Masada. He becomes the leader of the group at Masada that culminates in their destruction in the year 73 CE. And even though we often talk about the zealots, right? We've heard that term, the zealots, the leaders of the rebellion. In general, historians assume that there is a nuanced distinction between the group that fled back to Masada and the group that we know as zealots. The zealots were only a subset of the rebels in the year from the years 66 to 70. The group that fled back to Masada is known as the Sicarii. A Sicaris is a small Roman sword, and what these Sicarii would do, according to Josephus, is they would basically congregate in very busy places, and they would assassinate Jews who were regarded as Roman sympathizers. And so there are a number of stories that Josephus tells where during the course of the 1st century CE, so that is from the time of Judas the Galilean in the year 6 until the outbreak of the rebellion in the year 66, these Sicarii would assassinate, for example, some of the Kohanim Gedolim, who were understood by them to be Roman sympathizers. And so Josephus talks about them as cruel tyrants. We're going to see some passages where Josephus actually uses that language. So this group of Sicarii, rather than zealots in general, are the group that flee back to Masada. They stay at Masada for the duration of the war, and Josephus talks about actually a number of times when they don't only engage with the Romans, but they continue to prey on Jews who they regard as Roman sympathizers. And so Josephus talks about an event when they raided the Jewish community at Ein Gedi and decimated the Jewish community, again, because they regarded the Jews at Ein Gedi as Roman sympathizers. They stay there past the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, which takes place in the year 70 CE. So Judas in the year 6, outbreak of rebellion in the year 66, 4-year rebellion that lasts until the year 70. Then the Romans are basically involved in just cleaning up past trace of rebellion. And a final piece of that process is to be to put down the ongoing rebellion at Masada. Josephus talks about there being about 1,000 Jews who were convened at Masada, and they weren't necessarily only rebels. They may have been sort of a conglomeration of different groups, different people, perhaps even different sects, about 1,000 people. And we know that the Romans had a very difficult time laying siege to Masada. If we've been to Masada, we know, right? This was a very impressive feat of engineering when they actually built the battering ram that made its way up the ramp that enabled them to actually break through the walls of Masada. And they finally do that in the year 73. By the year 73, the Jews still had food, but archaeological excavations show that the food was full of all kinds of different pests. They found more moth larvae, they found mice droppings. And so the Jews at that point weren't necessarily even very healthy. But that wasn't the reason, according to Elazar ben Yair, why they ended up submitting to the Romans. They recognized that the end had come. Basically, the Romans in the year 73 built this battering ram, manages to take down the outer wall. Once it's taken down the outer wall, the Romans discovered that the Jews in the interim had built an inner wall. And so they need to now go do something about that. The battering ram couldn't reach this inner wall. And so what we'll see is that the Romans instead set fire to this inner wall. Sets fire to the inner wall. It manages to, a very large fire breaks out. And that's when the speech of Elazar ben Yair that we're going to read takes place. Namely, he speaks to the people and says, this is our final stand, but what we should do now is not submit to the Romans, rather we should come up with some sort of suicide pact. Okay, that's the story of Masada in a nutshell. Now, the story of Masada has become very important throughout the 20th century. Joseph, I know you said that growing up, you didn't feel like Masada, there was a presence of Masada until after the 6 Day War. Right. So that's very interesting. So what we know, so there is some evidence that Masada played an important role even in the pre-state Israel. So for example, the phrase Masada will never fall was actually coined by an Israeli poet named Yitzhak Lamdan in the year 1927. Yitzhak Lamdan in the year 1927 coins that phrase, Masada will never fall, in response to what was taking place in Europe then. And his idea was, namely, let's bring all of the Jews here. We Jews are surrounded on all sides by our enemies. We're isolated, we're surrounded, we're powerless. But if we come together as a people, we have the capacity to withstand. There was another important early advocate of Masada, sort of as an important site, was someone named Shmaryahu Gutman. So let's take a look at the first source on the source sheet. So I have here that this is from 1973, but actually this is the translation is from 1973. The Shmaryahu Gutman was an important Zionist in the 1930s and 1940s, 1930s, 40s, 50s, who would take a lot of youth groups on trips to Masada. And this is what he wrote in the 1940s. He said, Masada is not just the historical site that researchers study. Masada is not simply an ancient fortress that one digs to find archaeological remains through which one can learn about the past in order to support or refute theories. Namely, Masada is not just any other historical site. What is it? Masada is a symbol. Masada is a guideline. Masada is longing. Masada is a loud cry. Masada is a tower of light. Masada is a symbol of Jewish and human heroism in all its greatness. A generation of youth was raised by Masada. This is the generation that created the state, the generation of defense in its various manifestations. Masada has been the source of power and courage to liberate the country, to strike roots in it, and defend its whole territory. What Gutman is doing is drawing a direct line between Zionism, the founding of the state of Israel, and what took place at Masada. Masada becomes more than just a historical episode from the past. It becomes symbolic of everything that the state of Israel stands for. Isolated, besieged, surrounded on all sides by their enemies, but capable of fighting back. Something similar we find in the next source, which is a translation of a poem by the Israeli poet Uriel Ofeik from 1976. Ofeik there says, under the swords they fell, the Masada heroes, for they had rejected eternal slavery. Their heroic act our hearts has filled since the far days of our childhood. Just notice the language that he's using. So he's constantly connecting his 20th century reality with the story of Masada. Masada is not just a historical episode from the past. And he goes on in kind of similar terms and says in the next paragraph, we stood still. Again, he's not talking about Masada. We stood still, the thunder roared, and we all knew so well. Uriel Ofeik, it is good to die and be ever free, than become our enemy's slaves. Again, Masada becomes important as a symbol for what Zionism and for what the state represents. Within this narrative, the important protagonists in the story are the Jews at Masada, the rebels, and their enemies, the Romans. Those are the two important parties. The sort of climax of this connection between Zionism and the state and Masada can be appreciated by just by introducing a little bit the archaeologist who excavated Masada. The archaeologist who excavated Masada is named Yigal Yadin, and he excavated Masada in the years 1963 to 1965. Yadin's bio is important. Yadin was a very prominent archaeologist. He received a doctorate from Hebrew U in archaeology, but he also becomes a very important person within the Israeli government. He rises to a very high rank in the Israeli army, becomes the chief of staff to the head of the army. He, under Begin, becomes the deputy prime minister. And throughout his career, he's basically forced to alternate between times when he was free to do his archaeological excavations and publications and times when he was required to serve his country. Yadin makes clear that for him, the connection between Masada and Zionism was paramount. I talked about Yadin in the past. I think when we spoke about Bar Kokhba, I don't remember when that was, either January or last year. Right. So he was also, it's all a blur, right? Post-COVID is like one big, right? So Yadin was also the archaeologist who excavated the Bar Kokhba caves, who found the Bar Kokhba coins, and Bar Kokhba, it was January, right? So Yadin has an interesting quote when it comes to the Bar Kokhba caves. He found a letter that was written by Bar Kokhba that he presented to the Israeli president, who at that time was Yitzhak Ben Tzvi. And he says, Mr. Nasi, I have a letter for you that was written by the last Nasi of Israel, right? So Bar Kokhba refers to himself, Shimon ben Kosiba was his actual name, refers to himself as the Nasi in this letter. And this was, again, a way of Yadin connecting the dots between the past and the present. Just to read a passage from Yadin's work about Masada. So the Hebrew popular work, it's not on the sheet, the Hebrew popular work that he writes about Masada in the year 1966 was called Masada Bayamim Hahem Bazman Hazeh. Again, the title itself, Yamim Hahem Zman Hazeh, makes explicit that there is a connection. Just listen to what he describes in terms of his experience excavating. He says, the site of the adjoining camps, Silva's and our own, Flavius Silva is the person who was the Roman general who was responsible for overseeing the siege, was not without its symbolism, and it expressed far more poignantly than scores of statements something of the miracle of Israel's renewed sovereignty, right? He starts out by saying, I appreciated the renewal of Israel's sovereignty. Here, with the ruins of the camp belonging to the destroyers of Masada, a new camp had been established by the revivers of Masada, right? It's the connection between the past and the present is unmistakable, so that when we in general think about Masada, the popular perception of Masada positions two groups against each other, Jews and Romans. What I want to show is that in the telling of Josephus, the Romans were very much an ancillary consideration. For Josephus, the important parties here were the Jews and God. And that whereas modern Zionism celebrates the rebels, celebrates their suicide as an act of resistance, basically as a way of standing up for Jewish pride, as a way for, in the Zionist telling, standing up for Jewish power, the way that Josephus tells it is this was the final blow that was struck by God. This was the ultimate punishment for everything that the rebels had done throughout the course of the war. Okay, so that's where we're going to go during the remainder of this talk. Now, we don't necessarily have a reason for doubting. Well, it's not that we don't have a reason. The archaeological evidence leaves open the possibility that, in fact, the story of Masada took place the way that we're always taught that it took place. Namely, you have the speech by Elazar ben Yair. He urges the 1,000 people that are convened at Masada to fall on their swords. Basically, it's technically not an act of mass suicide. The story that Josephus tells is the Jews are going to draw lots. The final 10 people, there will be 10 people chosen. Those final 10 people will be responsible for killing all of the men after all of the men killed their own families. Those final 10 people will then draw lots again. The person who draws the final lot will be responsible for killing the other 9, and then will be responsible for committing suicide. So actually, it was just a series of murders, right? The only person who actually technically commits suicide is this very last person. It may be that the story happened that way. The archaeology is a little bit open to interpretation. So for example, Yadin discovered 3 skeletons that were next to each other. He discovers an adult male. Nearby, he discovers an adult female. And he also discovers a female child. And what Yadin hypothesizes is that this collection of skeletons, adult male, adult female, child, represents one of these families that, according to Josephus, had the adult male killing the others. And this adult male made sure that the 10 people who went around murdering all of the other adult males killed him next to his family. That's Yadin's interpretation. Other historians, other archaeologists say no. If we scrutinize the skeletons more closely, in fact, these don't represent 3 discrete skeletons. Rather, they represent a collection of bones that was arbitrarily put together. Again, these are arguments that archaeologists make back and forth. Yadin also discovered a cave with 25 different skeletons in it. Yadin hypothesized that these 25 skeletons were among the group of Jews that committed suicide, and that the Romans displaced their skeletons to this cave. Other archaeologists say, but if you look at the pig bones that were found in that cave, the better hypothesis is that these were not the remains of Jewish rebels, they were the remains of Roman soldiers. Again, open to interpretation. It's not that Yadin's interpretation confirming Josephus is wrong, but it does suggest that there is at least room for interpretation. The most outstanding archaeological discovery of Yadin's at Masada was what he said are the discovery of these 10 lots. I said before that there were 10 lots that designated the final 10 people who would be responsible for murdering everybody. He said, I found the 10 lots. Now, he said, I found the 10 lots. They all have names on them. They were all written by the same person, right? You're able to scrutinize the hand. The problem is that he didn't discover 10 lots, he discovered 12 lots. Now, one of them, in fact, if you look at it, is only a partially written name. So according to Yadin, that 12th of them was the beginning of the name that wasn't completed, which leaves us still with 11 lots. One of these 11 says Ben Yair. Elazar ben Yair was the leader of the rebels. So Yadin says when Josephus talked about 10 lots, 10 people, it was 10 plus Ben Yair. Maybe, right? But that's his interpretation. In fact, he finds 11 such lots. That's at least some grounds for skepticism. The other reason for doubting his interpretation of these lots as basically corresponding to the 10 lots that Josephus describes is that, in fact, these lots, which are basically potsherds with names on them, names inscribed on them, were found in a larger collection of about 250 such potsherds with names on them. It's just that the other 240 were not all written by the same hand. All of them have names on them. What other historians suggest, and Yadin doesn't necessarily dispute this, is that the other 240 were written for some other reason. So Yadin suggests, and others follow, these other 240 perhaps were written as designations for the distribution of food. When they had to distribute food to rebel families, they would write the names of the male heads of each family, and that's what the other 240 represent. But these 12 that I found alongside of them, which are all written by one name, are for some other purpose. Yadin might be right, but at least it's important to note that there are reasons for skepticism. I'll just take one second. The other consideration is that, according to Josephus, the Jews burned all of their foodstuff that remained because they didn't want the Romans to think that they had died. When the Romans get up there and they find 1,000 people are dead, they wanted to make sure that the Romans didn't suspect that they had died by starvation. So they made sure to burn all of their food. The problem is, as I said before, when Yadin excavates the site, he finds food. So Yadin says, well, it must be that they burned some of their food, but they didn't destroy all of their food. It's possible, right? But the point is that the archaeology is at a minimum open to interpretation, which means that when we're thinking about the story of Masada, it's not enough to ask what exactly happened, because the answer is we don't really know. We have Josephus's account, we have the archaeology, which could go both ways. And so therefore, what I want to propose is that the right question, as we discussed last week, is not what happened at Masada, but rather what happened at Josephus's Masada. Okay, I'll take 2 minutes of questions. Yeah.
If the Jews all committed suicide, did Josephus know what happened?
Okay, so Josephus says, thank you for asking that. Josephus says that there were 7 people, 2 women and 5 children, who took refuge in a cistern on Masada, managed to escape, and made their way to Rome and told Josephus about what had happened. Now, what we're going to read at length Josephus's account of the speech of Elazar ben Yair. It's important to note that in antiquity, historians, even historians who aspired to true accounts of history, had no compunction about inventing speeches. And this goes back to the great ancient historian Thucydides. Thucydides, who's the great historian of the Peloponnesian War in the 5th century BCE, basically says as follows, just going to quickly read a passage from him. On the one hand, writing in the 5th century BC, so this is 500 years before Josephus, he says, I'm going to tell, quote, a true picture of the events which have happened. So I'm going to be completely, my account is completely true, but he says, I have described nothing sorry, but he says, as to the speeches which were made either before or during the war, it was hard for me and for others who reported them to me to recollect the exact words. I have therefore put into the mouth of each speaker the sentiments proper to the occasion, expressed as I thought he would be likely to express them, while at the same time I endeavored as nearly as I could to give the general purport of what was actually said. So even historians who alleged that they were going to tell a completely accurate account, which Josephus says he's going to do, still had no problem inventing speeches. And so we need to keep that in mind, namely, even if it's true that there were 2 women and 5 children who fled to Rome, took refuge and made their way to Rome, it still is very likely that even if Josephus has not invented a lot of the story, even if we grant Josephus the basic outlines of the story, there's good reason for suspecting that the speech itself was largely invented, especially if these 2 women and 5 children weren't necessarily present at this time, right? So we don't know. Josephus doesn't say they heard the speech and then they went and hid, right? So I want to read the speech of Elazar ben Yair through that lens, namely, perhaps it happened in the way that Josephus described. The speech itself, there's a good chance, was probably invented. Okay, let's get started. Page 1 at the bottom. So this is Josephus introducing the Sicarii. We're going to read, basically going to stick to the bolded sections of the passages. Josephus introducing the story of Masada at the end of book 7. There are only 7 books in Jewish war. This is virtually the last episode that Josephus narrates. He says, the fortress was called Masada, the bottom of page 1. Fortress was called Masada, and the Sicarii who had occupied it had held by at their head a man of influence named Elazar. He was a descendant of Judas. So Judas the Galilean, who I mentioned before, was the really first rebel, according to Josephus, was not only the father of Menachem, but was also a relative of Elazar ben Yair, the leader of the Sicarii at Masada. And he says, the 4th bolded line here, for in those days the Sicarii clubbed together against those who consented to submit to Rome, and in every way treated them as enemies, plundering their property, rounding up their cattle, setting fire to their habitations, protesting that such persons were no other than aliens who so ignobly sacrificed the hard-won liberty of the Jews and admitted their preference for the Roman yoke. Namely, what is it that the Sicarii stood for? The Sicarii stood for liberty and escape from enslavement. And so therefore, anyone who committed themselves to the Romans was regarded as a sympathizer, somebody who was willing to submit to slavery, somebody who avoided recapturing liberty and therefore was put to death by the Sicarii. Turn the page to page 2. At the top, Josephus goes on to say these were bent on tyranny. Namely, it's not the Romans who were tyrants, it's the Sicarii who were tyrants. They were bent on tyranny, those on violence, and plundering the property of the wealthy. The Sicarii were the first to set the example of this lawlessness and cruelty to their kinsmen. So the Sicarii are not only direct descendants of Judas, but they are also the first group of rebels at the point in time at which rebellion begins to really flourish. So the Sicarii play this pivotal role. What Josephus is arguing here is that the Sicarii, this group at Masada, embodied the rebels as a whole. So that the story that he's going to tell about Masada is not just the story about these 1,000 Sicarii. This is really a story about the rebels as a whole, which he's tracing from Judas the Galilean until the fall of Masada, which is important because what Josephus really is saying is Masada is the nail in the coffin of the rebellion and of God's treatment of the rebels, who, as I said before, as I said going back to the first talk, what Josephus is arguing about the rebels is these are the exceptions to the rule. These are the bad apples. These are the Jews who don't stand for Roman values. And so therefore, what I am going to show you, Josephus says, about Masada is that Masada was not an act of resistance against the Romans. What he's going to say is this was an act of divine punishment. Yeah.
Were these the same people who burned the food in Yerushalayim?
So not the, they were among the people that burnt the food in Yerushalayim.
So it was a larger group.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, please.
What Right, how are they known in Hebrew?
Right. I mean, so it's a Greek word. So if you were so it would be Sicarus with a kuf. Right, correct. Right. Right, but the sakin, right, but that's not where the word comes from. Meaning, right, but they use the Sicarus, which is a Greek word, which is not right. Meaning, it's cute to call them sakinaim because it just happens to be right. But yeah. Right. So it is. It's just that the etymology is not sakin, but that's interesting. Okay. Let's continue. What ties of friendship or of kindred but render these men more audacious in their daily murders? Namely, it didn't make a difference how they were related to the people. Even ties of kindred didn't prevent them from actually murdering those who they regarded as sympathizers. Just notice, what Josephus is doing is he's laying the groundwork. He's already foreshadowing what's going to happen in saying that these Sicarii in their heyday didn't have any compunction about even murdering their families. Or to do injury to a foreigner, they considered an act of petty malice, but thought they cut a splendid figure by maltreating their nearest relations. Accordingly, these each found a fitting end, God awarding due retribution to them all. So he's already hinting at the role that God is going to play. Let's jump ahead to the next passage. Next passage is already describing the siege against Masada. I said before that the Jews built an inner wall. The outer wall was destroyed by the battering ram. The inner wall couldn't be touched by the battering ram. And so what the Romans ended up doing is they ended up setting fire to it. And that's what Josephus describes here. But look at what he says in the bolded section of this paragraph. Then suddenly the wind veering, as if by divine providence, to the south, and blowing with full force in the opposite direction, wafted and flung the flames against the wall, which now through and through was all ablaze. The Romans, thus blessed by God's aid, returned rejoicing to their camp. So what ends up happening, according to Josephus, this is even before the suicide. This is the event that leads to the suicide because now both of their walls have been destroyed, but you can already detect God's hand in the event because what ended up happening? The Romans set fire to this inner wall. The wind began to push the fire back in the direction of the Romans, but miraculously, according to Josephus, it ended up pushing once again in the direction of the Jews because what God was trying to do here was to punish the Jews. The protagonists in the story are not going to end up being Romans and Jews. The Romans are just going to be the vehicle for divine punishment. The Jews. That's a good question. I guess they must have destroyed. There must have been wood on Masada that they ended up destroying. It's a good question. I'm not sure. Okay, let's continue. So now the inner wall has been destroyed. Elazar ben Yair now gets up and speaks to the people. And he says as follows: at this crisis, let us not disgrace ourselves. We who in the past refused to submit even to a slavery involving no peril, let us not now, along with slavery, deliberately accept the irreparable penalties awaiting us if we are to fall alive into Roman hands. We've always resisted slavery. We've always embraced liberty. If we give in to the Romans, they're going to treat us very cruelly. So maybe indeed, it goes on in the next bolded passage, maybe indeed we ought from the very first, when having chosen to assert our liberty, we invariably experienced such hard treatment from one another, and still harder from our foes, we ought, I say, to have read God's purpose and to have recognized that the Jewish race, once beloved of him, had been doomed to perdition. This is the first trace that Elazar himself maybe expresses some sort of regret, recognizes that their failure to defeat the Romans, they're in basically what is an impregnable fortress. Their failure to defeat the Romans, to repel the Roman siege, must be because God has abandoned them. So therefore, maybe we should have, until now, maybe we should have detected that our approach was misguided. He goes on in similar terms on page 3. Says, but did we forsooth hope that we alone of all the Jewish nation would survive and preserve our freedom as persons guiltless toward God and without a hand in crime? we who had even been the instructors of the rest, it's not reasonable for us to have assumed that God would somehow save us, because after all, everything that we did, we are not guiltless. We are not without a hand in the crime. And not only that, we are the instructors of the rest. What I said before, that what Josephus is trying to do is to position this group basically as embodying all of the rebels. And so what Elazar ben Yair is saying here is we shouldn't regard ourselves as being blameless. And he acknowledges what we just saw in Josephus. What does he say in the next bolded passage? He says, "For it was not of their own accord that those flames which were driving against the enemy turned back upon the wall constructed by us." He recognizes what Josephus just said, which is the only possible explanation for the direction of the fire, basically going against the wind, is because God was there. No, all this betokens wrath at the many wrongs which we madly dare to inflict upon our countrymen. The penalty for these crimes let us pay not to our bitterest foes, the Romans, but to God through the act of our own hands. It will be more tolerable than the other. Let our wives thus die undishonored, our children unacquainted with slavery, and when they are gone, let us render a generous service to each other, preserving our liberty as a noble winding sheet. So he starts out by focusing on these principles of liberty and escape from slavery, which were really the rallying cry of this group throughout the war. He embeds within this argument this discussion about God, basically as a secondary consideration. We need to preserve our liberty. We need to commit ourselves to our old convictions, basically by killing ourselves. And in doing so, we need to recognize God wants to punish us anyway. And so what we would be doing is submitting to God rather than to the Romans. It's a secondary consideration. The main point of his argument, right, if we look at how it's framed in the beginning and the end, he's focusing on liberty and slavery. Now look at how the Jews, the other rebels, respond to this. Next paragraph. They say, Josephus says, so that Elazar has stopped speaking. He assumes that this is going to be a winning argument because after all that he's doing is preaching to the choir. These are people who have stood for liberty, for escape from enslavement for the course of, the last several decades. But what happened? So some of them responded nobly, but others, I'm in the bolded passage in the next paragraph, but others softer hearted, and softer hearted in the Greek is effeminate. So others who are softer hearted, who are effeminate, were moved with pity for their wives and families. We're going to come back to that point, the fact that Josephus says they are moved by pity. Now we might say it's reasonable, right? But what does it mean for them to be pitying their families? That Elazar is encouraging each man to kill his family. And what they're saying is, we are reluctant to do that. And yet it's clear that Josephus condemns this point of view by describing it as a feminine act. Remember, we talked about the importance of manly bravery. What Josephus is doing is condemning this response. We're going to talk about, as I said, talk about pity in a few minutes. They are moved with pity and doubtless also by the vivid prospect of their own end. And their tears, as they looked upon one another, revealed their unwillingness of heart. So there's a note of criticism here, not only in referring to them as women, but also by saying they didn't respond positively to the principles that they had subscribed to that had really animated their actions over the course of several decades. It's not just that their attitude was misplaced, right? It's not just that God was punishing them for what they had done, but in the end, ultimately, in the end, they're sort of frauds, according to Josephus, because if they were committed to liberty, to escape from enslavement, they would have had the courage to stand up and kill themselves and kill their families. Yeah.
Original case, this is suicide.
Right.
He was happy to stand by and let everybody commit suicide. Then comes up with a self-serving idea that God wanted to preserve him, and then he writes the narrative. This is very, it's like when Napoleon said, that the history is a accepted fable.
So the mirror image, the connecting the dots between those two stories is very important. We're not going to get into it, but absolutely, right, is basically the point. Okay, but we don't have time to get into comparing the two stories, but yeah, it's an important point. Okay, so he recognizes then that he needs to move on from this first argument. He then makes a second argument, which is a philosophical argument about immortality of the soul. We're going to skip that part of the argument and go instead to his final argument, which ends up being the winning argument. So we're in the same passage. The last word on the line is the word the. Okay, it's bolded, the word the. The crisis is one that calls upon us to bear it with stout heart, since it is by God's will and of necessity that we are to die. He's not starting this final argument with liberty and slavery. He's starting this final argument with God. And he's going beyond what he said before, because what he said before is we have a choice. We can be defeated by the Romans. We're going to be treated poorly. They're going to take our women and children. Or we could submit to God because we recognize that God wants to punish us. But the Jews have a choice. What he said so far, just in this first line, is that the Jews don't have a choice. It is by God's will and of necessity that we are to die. That word necessity is critical. Look at the bottom passage from Plato. Context here is Plato's dialogue known as the Phaedo, and the Phaedo is describing the dialogue that takes place in the final hours of Socrates' life. And for the most part, the dialogue is one focused on immortality of the soul. This passage, though, is important. They say, the person that is having the dialogue with Socrates says, why in the world do they say that it is not permitted to kill oneself, Socrates? To which Socrates says, then perhaps from this point of view, it is not unreasonable to say that a man must not kill himself until God sends some necessity upon him. The word for necessity is ananke. That's the very same word that Josephus puts in the mouth of Elazar ben Yair, meaning what Elazar ben Yair is appropriating this old Platonic notion that when can you commit suicide? When you are compelled to do so by God. That's the argument that he's now making. So that Elazar earlier allowed for two possible outcomes, but and he assumed that the other rebels would naturally take the right approach, but in the end, it turns out not to have been the case. So now he argues, we don't have a choice. God has stayed our hand. We have to commit suicide. This is now a theological argument, not a principled argument about slavery and about liberty, but about what God demands of them. Let's turn the page. I'm sorry, just that last bolded passage right above the passage from Plato. Do not attach the blame to yourselves, nor the credit to the Romans, that this war with them has been the ruin of us all. For it was not their might that brought these things to pass, but the intervention of some more powerful cause has afforded them the semblance of victory. Some more powerful cause is God, right? God is the one who stands behind all of this. He then goes on and says on the next page, let us have pity on ourselves, our children, and our wives while it is still in our power to find pity from ourselves, right? We need to show pity. We need to remain courageous. Going down to the last bolded passage in this paragraph where it says, no, while those hands are free and grasp the sword, let them render an honorable service. Unenslaved by the foe, let us die as free men with our children and wives. Let us quit this life together. This our laws enjoin. This our wives and children implore of us. The need for this is of God's sending. So here, this is a thoroughly theological argument embedded within which is language of liberty and slavery. But this is a very different type of argument. And it's this argument that ends up being the winning argument. So let's take a look at what happens next. He would have pursued his exhortation, but was cut short by his hearers, who, overpowered by some uncontrollable impulse, were all in haste to do the deed. Like men possessed, they went their way. What is he describing? He's hinting at the fact that God is present. What he just described was Elazar ben Yair's claim that God is compelling them to do this. So why is it that they respond favorably to this argument about God and theology, whereas they should have responded favorably to the first argument, which was consistent with their principles? According to Josephus, what he's hinting at is they respond favorably now, not because they feel like this is the right thing to do, but because God now is intervening directly and is compelling them to respond. They're overpowered by some uncontrollable impulse. Like men possessed, they went their way. Again, they're possessed now, the language of God taking over them, each eager to outstrip his neighbor and deeming it a signal proof of courage. So ardent the passion that had seized them to slaughter their wives, their little ones, and themselves. The bolded passage at the end of this paragraph at that same instant as though served by hands other than their own. Again, hinting at the role of God here. This is not, they lack agency, right? So they're present, they try to be courageous, but basically they are bodies that are completely being controlled by someone other than their own, namely by God. They accomplish their purpose. This is Josephus, again, this is all Josephus. Wretched victims of necessity, to whom to slay with their own hands, their own wives and children seemed the lightest of evils. It's clear, according to Josephus, that the act of murder-suicide at Masada was not the result of bravery, of conviction, of resistance, but rather of direct divine punishment. And there are foreshadowings, echoes of all of Elazar ben Yair's speech in earlier passages. I want to take a look very briefly in the few minutes that we have left at a couple of these. The first passage at the bottom of page 4 is a speech by Agrippa II, who was the leader of the Jews. This is immediately before the war breaks out. He senses that rebellion is on the horizon, and he speaks to the people and says as follows in the year 66. Agrippa II in Jerusalem, not only speaking to the Sicarii, but to the rebels in general, says, "Passing to your present passion for liberty, I say that it comes too late." It's too late for liberty. The Romans have ruled over us for 100 years. This wasn't the time to fight on behalf of liberty. What should you do? Goes on and says, God is not on our side. The Romans are not on our side. Third paragraph here. All who embark on war do so in reliance on the support either of God or man. But when in all probability no assistance from either quarter is forthcoming, then the aggressor goes with his eyes open to certain ruin, right? You are being irrational. What is there then to prevent you from dispatching with your own hands your children and wives, and from consigning this surpassingly beautiful home of yours to the flames? He's predicting already in the year 66 what is going to happen at Masada, is Agrippa, and saying, you are inappropriately focusing on liberty, which is a misguided priority, because liberty was something for us to think about 100 years ago. If you go down this path, he's saying, you will inevitably end up killing your own families. Now, again, Agrippa doesn't have Masada in mind, but what is happening here, Josephus is already putting into the mouth of Agrippa II the events that will take place in the year 73, because for Josephus, that is the culmination of the rebellion in general. Turn the page for a second. He says, take pity at the top. Take pity then, if not on your children and your wives, at least on your mother city. What did we see in the story of Masada? What Josephus says in Masada is that the people felt like they had to have pity on their children and their wives. Josephus's point is that emotion was too little, too late. Really, what they should have done was had pity at the beginning. Where did they go wrong? By pinpointing liberty as kind of their guiding principle, not having pity on their spouses and their children. Instead, it only came about in the 11th hour, when really hope was lost, that they finally came around to the realization that they had to have pity. This pity, I'm just one more minute and then I'll stick around for questions. Ananas ben Ananas, who we saw in the first talk, was sort of the hero of Josephus. This is, if the rebels are the bad apples, Ananas ben Ananas represents the best of the Jews. He's the Kohen Gadol, who was represented the moderate faction among the Jews. And in the year 68, when he sees that the Jews are going in a more extreme direction, he says the following to the rebels in Jerusalem. He says in the second paragraph here, he says, on page 5, have you then lost that most honorable, that most instinctive of passions, the desire for liberty? Have we fallen in love with slavery, in love with our masters, as though submission were a heritage from our forefathers? What he's saying is, he's not talking about liberty, freedom from the Romans. He's talking about freedom from the rebels themselves, who we said already were involved in assassinating any sympathizers. They were involved in trying to quell any sort of resistance to the rebellion. What Ananas is saying is the absence of liberty, tyranny, is not coming from the Roman end. It's coming from the Jews themselves. That's the absence of liberty. Meaning what he's saying is the Jews, the Sicarii, the other rebels, who looked at liberty and freedom from enslavement as their guiding light, in fact, they were the ones who were imposing enslavement, who were withdrawing liberty from the other Jews. And so it's not a coincidence then that when it comes to the events at Masada, that God basically withdraws their capacity to act freely. Again, this is Midah. What we're seeing is throughout this story is Midah keneged Midah. And even at the end, and this is important, even at the end, they still don't understand what liberty represents. They still, based on Elazar ben Yair's speech, they still think that liberty means freedom from Rome. So what Josephus is saying is, he's saying, first of all, they acted basically just as devices of God, right? The murder-suicide was not their priority. It was not their decision. It was God forcing this. And the background to that was still a lack of recognition that they had ever acted inappropriately. They still felt, even as Elazar ben Yair says, we're being punished, etc., their focus on liberty was misguided. They still thought that the Romans and not they were those who would deprive the other Jews of liberty. And so what Josephus is doing in general then, just to sort of bring this whole story to a close, what Josephus is doing in the story of Masada is concluding the trajectory of his narrative, which begins at the outset of Jewish war, where his basic argument is that the Jews are good citizens of the Roman Empire, that they were simply swept away in this rebellious frenzy, led by these bad apples, these groups of Jews like the Sicarii embodying the rest of the rebels because they're descended from Judas and because they were the instructors of the rest of the rebels. They're the ones who ended up leading the Jews astray. The God of the Jews recognized that this is not a set of Jewish values. And so therefore, the God of the Jews, Josephus says to his Romans, ended up punishing the rebels in this very extreme way, this dramatic episode of murder-suicide, precisely because the Jews had betrayed their Jewish values. And so therefore, what he's saying to his Roman audience in the year 79, within 10 years of the Khurban, is don't blame the Jews, embrace the Jews. The Jews are consistent with good Roman values. And in that way, I think what Josephus is basically doing is he's setting a framework for a diaspora mindset for the next 2,000 years. What he's basically saying is to the Jews and to the non-Jews, what he's basically saying is you want to feel comfortable in your surroundings. It's not enough for you to be Jewish. What you also need to do, he's saying to his Jewish audience, is you need to embrace the values of the outside world and show how those values are expressive of your Jewish beliefs, of your Jewish practice. And he's saying at the same time to his Roman audience, understand that the Jews, simply because they are insular, simply because they only marry amongst themselves, simply because they have these laws of kashrus, they have laws of Shabbos, which don't represent laziness, as we said in the first talk, saying to his Roman audience, don't blame the Jews. All of those areas of halacha and all areas of Jewish practice, in fact, are consistent, are aligned with the very same values that you subscribe to. Thank you very much. I'll stick around for questions and